Thank you for joining us today for Digging for Truth. I'm your host, Henry Smith. Today, we're completing a two-part episode with our friend and New Testament scholar, Dr. Craig Evans of Houston Baptist University. He's here again to talk about Jesus and the Mythicists. Dr. Evans, welcome back to Digging for Truth for part two.
Thank you, Henry. Good to be back.
It's good to see you again. All right, so we want to encourage folks, first of all, to watch the first part of our episode, episode 137 on our YouTube channel, or if you've recorded it on TV. But we're going to talk about Jesus and the Mythicists some more. So maybe you could give the audience sort of a summary of what we talked about and sort of define again for maybe someone who's joining us again, some of the definitions.
Yes, of course. Mythicism is the idea that Jesus is a myth, not a real person. No one really named Jesus from Nazareth existed in the first century, and that his followers are actually some Jewish people that got together and whatever stimulated it, maybe a vision, a dream, or something like that, and then they cobbled together some ideas from pagan sources, ancient Near Eastern, Egyptian, Greco-Roman, whatever, and they create what some historians call a Frankenstein of a redeemer who comes down from heaven and teaches the way of salvation. And then somehow in the passage of time, after a century or two, it's forgotten that this is really a visionary heavenly figure, and he's turned into a human being who walks around on the earth, that person who actually lived. And so the Gospels then are misunderstood. The Gospels really are just like fairy tales, parables, and they begin to be interpreted literally, and this is confusing. And of course now the mythicists of the modern era is alert to this and says, hey, wait a minute, no, this is not how it started. It's just all a myth, and we need to get back to that.
Yeah, it's a good summary. And again, we encourage people to watch the first episode so they get the context of what we're talking about. So it's interesting, you brought up earlier Celsus, who Origen attempted to refute in his work Contra Celsus, who didn't believe that Jesus was the Messiah and who the Gospels claimed he was, but he didn't deny his existence. Now there's many other examples of early anti-Christian writers, but they never denied the existence of Jesus. Let's talk about them a little bit.
Yeah, that's a good question, and Celsus or Celsus is a good place to begin, because this guy knows paganism inside and out, and he compares the Jesus story to some of the Greco-Roman mythology. And what's interesting is he finds the Jesus story uncompelling because it doesn't measure up to the Greco-Roman mythology. He says, what God would allow this? What God would do that? What God would allow himself to be persecuted or suffer or be nailed on a cross? What God would do that? And when Jesus is resurrected, he ought to appear to Pilate, and he ought to appear to the high priest. And so I think it's really funny if mythicism on its own terms suffers shipwreck, because the pagans certainly don't see Jesus as a pagan style God or redeemer. So that's interesting. So Celsus in a way is no friend to the mythicists. He doesn't deny that Jesus existed. He doesn't deny the reality of the incarnation, the humanity of Jesus, or a place like Nazareth. He makes capital on the fact that the historical Jesus in the Gospels simply doesn't measure up to pagan standards. So I think that needs to be made clear at the beginning. Now, the other people you're referring to, Josephus is a Jewish scholar, an apologist, and a younger contemporary of the Jesus movement, of the original disciples. He does not doubt that Jesus existed, and so he explains where the Christian movement comes from in a text that is admittedly tampered with, but in two places in his Jewish Antiquities, he references Jesus. In one of the places, by the way, notes that Jesus is the brother of James, who when he was put to death in the year 62, unlawfully, that resulted in the removal of Annas Jr. as the high priest. Then there's Tacitus, a Roman historian, who, by the way, does not like the Jewish people, does not like Christians. He doesn't want to do Jews or Christians any favors. He doesn't doubt that Jesus existed. He talks about what happened to Jesus, crucified under the order of Pilate. Well, where does he get this information? He didn't read the Gospels. He knows
Right.
this. He has access to Roman records. He knows where Christianity came from. He's a rather well-informed Roman skeptic and historian. Suetonius is a biographer. A biographer of what? Of the emperors. And he knows of Jesus and refers to him with no sympathy at all.
Yes.
And we could continue on into the 2nd century with other writers. They know Jesus existed. They don't doubt it, but they don't have any sympathy for the Christian movement.
Yeah, these are what we usually call in an apologetic argument hostile witnesses.
They're good examples of that. Yeah.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I was reminded too when I was reflecting on this is in the Talmud, which is the rabbinic writings, who are the ancestors or the forebears later of the Pharisees, and they mention Jesus too, and they attribute his miracles to Satan, the work of Satan, just like they do in the New Testament, which is an egregious sin, of course. You couldn't be any more hostile than that against someone who they clearly believe existed.
Oh yeah, they do a real job on on Jesus. They accuse Mary of adultery, so you can see where they come down on the question of Jesus's birth. They don't deny that Jesus did wondrous things and could do some remarkable teaching, but it's attributed to a pact with the devil. It's attributed to black magic, a misuse of the divine name, and so forth. And so, again, you have all kinds of critics, Jewish, Greek, Roman, pagan, you name it, all kinds of critics in the 1st century as well as in the 2nd century. Not one of them ever raises a question about the existence of Jesus.
Yeah, this is what, and I've mentioned this in other episodes, this is what C.S. Lewis referred to as chronological snobbery. Yeah, somehow in the modern day, we know better that Jesus didn't exist, but all of these people who lived in the ancient world, both hostile and people who embraced Jesus, believed in his existence. It's a very incoherent kind of way of argumentation. Well, friends, thank you for joining us for Digging for Truth today. We're here with Dr. Craig Evans. We're talking about Jesus and the Mythicists, and we'll be right back.
In a culture of intense Bible-denying skepticism, Associates for Biblical Research exists to strengthen followers of Jesus by affirming the authority of the Bible. Our archaeological fieldwork and original research form a strong foundation in upholding the reliability of the Scriptures. For students or anyone asking if they can really trust the Bible, please visit our website and partner with us by joining our prayer team or financially supporting this ministry. And thank you for standing with us.
Hi, welcome back to Digging for Truth. I'm your host, Henry Smith. I'm here with Dr. Craig Evans. We're talking about Jesus and the Mythicists. And I'd like to refer you first, before we get back to Dr. Evans, to 2 episodes we did with Dr. Evans on his book, Jesus and the Manuscripts. And these episodes 122 and 123 provide supporting evidence for the case we're making here about the historicity of Jesus. Now, Dr. Evans, I was making the point about chronological snobbery at the end of our last segment, and you'd like to build on that a little bit. Why don't you go ahead?
Well, yeah, that's a good point. And C.S. Lewis is correct. And remember, who is C.S. Lewis? Well, he was at Oxford. He's a brilliant man. A lot of people know him as a writer of marvelous, creative fantasy literature and so on. What they don't know is his training actually was in philosophy. He was a very smart man. And one of the things that needs to be made clear with this snobbery, where we moderns think we're real smart and people from antiquity were stupid and naive and gullible, that just isn't true. You read some of the writings of people like Lucian of Samosata or Galen and others, they are smart people, and they raise objections all the time to mythology. Many of them were atheists in the sense that they did not believe in the gods of the Greeks and the Romans. They believed that there was a God, but they did not believe in the stories of Mount Olympus and all the rest of that. And by the way, that's why Christians themselves were accused of being atheists, because they didn't believe in the Olympian gods either. Right. So the idea that, if you were an ancient person, you believed in fairy tales and you believed in Santa Claus and you believed anything, that's a misrepresentation. It's just not true.
Yeah, it's an unfair characterization of the people of the past, and it really misrepresents them in the way that you just described. Okay, so now we're going to shift a little bit. Let's talk about some of the stuff from your book, especially archaeological evidence related to Jesus. We talked about historians, but we've got some stuff from archaeology. There's the James ossuary. There's a magic charm, but I'll let you elaborate on that.
Yeah, I try to cover what I think is the most important archaeological evidence relating to Jesus in a book a few years ago called Jesus and the Remains of His Day. And it complements Jesus and the manuscript. So in other words, we have excellent evidence for Jesus that's written. The Gospels themselves, they were written early. The copies of the Gospels, they were numerous. They're early and they're well preserved, and so this evidence is reviewed in Jesus and the manuscripts. But the archaeological evidence for Jesus is strongly supportive, and one of the words that sums it up is a word I like to use. I usually have to explain it, but it's a Latin word, verisimilitude. Veri meaning truth, similitude meaning it's comparable to it. And any historian, any archaeologist is looking for verisimilitude. So just because you have a source that claims to be ancient, claims to be an eyewitness testimony or an account of something, you have to evaluate it. And one of the ways you evaluate it is you compare its claims to the archaeological record. And if you find correspondence, if you find that this document is supported by archaeology, you take it seriously. And that's the nice thing about the Gospels. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, even though John is the metaphorical one and is deeply theological and so on, John just drips with historical and archaeological verisimilitude. And I've done work, I know you have, and many of the people that you have interviewed on your show, Henry, have done archaeology. They've been at dig sites as archaeologists, or as like me, a volunteer, and digging stuff up, sifting it. I read the literature and so on. And what I've discovered is that the archaeologists use Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, the book of Acts, and Josephus. Those are the big 6 sources. And it's interesting that 4 of the 6 are Christian and in the New Testament. And these are archaeologists concerned with first century Israel. They wouldn't think of not using these sources, and they regard them as highly reliable. I have never met an archaeologist or read in the literature somebody who thinks you have to use a 2nd or 3rd century apocryphal source in order to understand what you're digging up. No, they never do. They always use Matthew, Mark, Luke, John to know where to dig and how to understand what they dig up. And I think that's a real vote in favor of the reliability of the Gospels, and it's a damning vote against mythicism.
Yeah, it would be exceedingly strange, one might say, to have all of these archaeological details about places and towns, the Pool of Bethesda, the Pool of Siloam, all these different places, the Synagogue of Capernaum, have all of that right and have Jesus wrong in terms of historicity. You know what I mean? Those things don't point to Jesus per se directly. But it's this context of historical accuracy that I think you're emphasizing here.
Oh, I certainly am. And there's a good example of it, too, on the other side. There is a gospel called the Gospel of Barnabas. Muslims like it because Jesus teaches the way they want him to teach. He teaches along with, say, the Quran. So he denies his divine sonship. He prophesies the coming of Muhammad as the true prophet, etc. So they go, okay, well, Gospel of Barnabas, is it as good as Matthew, Mark, Luke, John? Maybe we have 5 gospels we should be talking about. Well, here's the problem. The gospel of Barnabas doesn't get anything right. The gospel of Barnabas has the disciples rowing their boat across the Sea of Galilee, and they row their boat all the way to Nazareth. Now, I don't know, Henry, have you ever tried to do that? That's several miles inland over hills. That boat would be in bad shape by the time they got there. And it says they rowed their boat to Nazareth, and then they hiked inland up to Capernaum. Well, whoops. It's Capernaum that's on the northwest shore of the Sea of Galilee. And then it goes on and makes numerous other blunders. This shows the work lacks verisimilitude. So you're not going to be surprised that scholars concerned with historical Jesus ignore the Gospel of Barnabas, not because of theological bias or preference, but because the work is deeply flawed and makes numerous mistakes. So archaeologists use Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, but not Barnabas. And these are archaeologists who are Jewish, some of them agnostic, some of them even atheist. They use sources they know are reliable, and they don't use sources that aren't.
Yeah, that makes a great deal of sense. Now, I mentioned a magic charm, and what we're going to do is we're going to hold off on that. We'll talk about that in the next segment, and also this cup that was discovered underwater, which actually mentions the name of Jesus. And friends, we're here with Dr. Craig Evans. We're talking about Jesus and mythicism, and we'll be right back.
Bible in Spade is a non-technical quarterly publication published by the Associates for Biblical Research. Written from a scholarly and conservative viewpoint, Bible in Spade supports the inerrancy of the biblical record and is a must-read for both the serious Bible student and anyone asking if they can really trust the Bible. Archaeological Evidence, properly interpreted, upholding the history of the Bible. Subscribe today at BibleArchaeology.org.
Hi, welcome back to Digging for Truth. Today I'm here with Dr. Craig Evans. We're talking about Jesus and mythicism, the claim that Jesus never existed, and we're showing evidence to refute this absurd claim. Now, Dr. Evans, we wanted to get to this cup that was found in Alexandria that has the name of Jesus actually mentioned on it. We talked about it in our previous episode with you on Jesus and the manuscripts. Talk about that and a couple of other texts that actually talk about the name of Jesus himself.
Well, you know, we actually have perhaps as many as 3 items that date from the 1st century. Now, that's getting pretty early. And one of them is the cup that you just mentioned. It's a ceramic cup found in water near Alexandria. And so we think it's a magician's cup because there's a ceramic typology that would indicate that's what it's designed for. Originally a 2-handled cup. On one side it says the enchanter, and then on the other side, when you turn it around, it says through Christ. And so we supply a verb. It probably means the enchanter speaks, or the enchanter has his power through Christ. What's really interesting, Henry, is and you've interviewed archaeologists who know typology, ceramic typology. That's how we date it. And so the cup dates to at least 100 BC, maybe 150 BC. They know that from the way it's made. But the scratching, the etching, the inscription of these words, the enchanter through Christ, was added, they think, in the 1st century. And this would make it a very early pagan reference to Jesus. So what we think is going on is an Egyptian magician hears about this powerful figure, Jesus Christ, who chases away evil spirits and heals people. And so he, in a sense, upgrades his magic cup and makes it more powerful in his mind by referring to Jesus Christ. And this, we think, is probably mid 1st century AD, which makes it really early. There's another Egyptian artifact. It's a magic text, and it's in a collection of magic texts. This one is kept in Paris, And at line 3007 to 3086, we've got 80 lines, a magical charm for how to drive away evil spirits. And it refers to some Old Testament figures, including Solomon and Jeremiah and so on. But right in the middle of it, very interestingly, it says, now when you do all this stuff, and the incantation and all the rest of it, then you say, I adjure you, and that's the word exercise, I adjure you by the name of the God of the Hebrews, Jesus.
Amazing.
And what you think, what's the date of this? Well, in that same charm, it goes on to refer to the temple as still standing, where there's the altar of the eternal, unquenchable fire. Well, this would suggest the charm, when it was originally written, not the copy we now have, but when it was originally written, was prior to the year 70, because that's when the temple was destroyed and the altar was destroyed and the eternal flames was no longer burning. So now we have two pagan charms appealing to Jesus as enhancing magical power and perhaps protecting you from demons. And this is coming from pagans in Egypt. And the Christian movement is barely a generation old.
Phenomenal.
And then you mentioned the ossuary. Now, this is Jewish evidence, and there's nothing polemical about it or pagan about it. But we have the ossuary. We know from history, from Josephus and other sources, that James was murdered by High Priest Annas the Younger in the year 62, when the Roman governor had died and the new replacement hadn't arrived. So he took advantage of that, of killing James and some other Christians. Well, the ossuary then would be 1 year later, so it dates to the year 63, and on it says, James, son of Joseph, brother of Jesus. Now, we can't prove that these names apply to the people of the New Testament, but they probably do. And science has confirmed that this is an ancient inscription, even though it was disputed originally 20 years ago. It's now confirmed that the inscription, in fact, is genuine. So we could have as many as 3 references, 1 Jewish and 2 pagan, to Jesus in the first century. That is within the first generation of the Christian movement. That's potentially more weighty evidence against mythicism.
Yeah, more independent archaeological evidence to be added to the historical evidence that we've already discussed in the 2 episodes. For folks who are unfamiliar with the term ossuary, it's a bone box. The Jews would, in the first century, would bury their dead, go back a year later, collect the bones and put them in a bone box, and often write on the side of it who was in the box. Sometimes they wouldn't, sometimes they would. So, all right, Dr. Evans, believe it or not, we've got about 2 minutes left. I'd like you to give your best hard-hitting summary of all of this and why we should strongly reject this whole notion of mythicism.
Mythicism should be rejected whether you believe in God or not, whether you're a Christian or not. Mythicism should be rejected because we have first century evidence for Jesus. We have direct literary testimony from a person who knew his family, and that person is Paul. He knew James, the brother of Jesus. He knew Jesus's first disciples. And the idea that somehow this witness could be talking about somebody who actually didn't exist, and that the Christian movement gets underway in the first century, it's simply too close. You can't have a myth developed that takes place within a few years of the person who didn't exist. It is simply mentally and intellectually, it is absurd. And that's why the overwhelming majority of the scholarly community, whether they're Christian or not, the overwhelming majority rejects such a notion as incoherent, anti-intellectual, and just plain silly.
Well, Dr. Evans, that's a great summary of it. We're always careful about the way we critique things, but on this program, I think it's been pretty clear to our audience that you and I have been kind of strong in our language, because there are some ideas that are so bad, they have to be ridiculed somewhat. So, but we've also shown the evidence, and that's even more important. Thank you for being on the program, and thank you for all you do to be faithful to the gospel and to show the reliability of the New Testament.
Thank you, Henry.
It's great to have you on. Friends, I just want to implore you, if you've been watching the show today and you've thought that this might have credibility in some kind of way, I just want you to think about the words of the Apostle John. These things have been written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that believing you may have life in His name. Thank you for watching Digging for Truth.